Okay, so in this video we're going to take a look at understanding file and directory privileges a little bit more. We just saw in the last video how some users might have the authority to run some commands, some might not, and understanding when you have to operate at a higher privilege. I also hinted that some files or directories you might need a higher privilege to operate in, or you just might not have permission to. So I'd like to take a look at understanding how do you understand the privileges, how might you start setting some of the privileges for the different files and directories that already exist in Linux, as well as ones that you might create, as well as get an introduction to how you might change these. Okay, so the first thing to understand would be, how can I even look and see what the existing privileges already are? And we can do this through the ls command. So if I do just a normal ls, remember this will list the contents, but there's an option off of ls, a switch off of ls. I can do ls space and then -l. Okay, the -l command will list additional information, including the privileges. And now the way you can kind of read through this is, it looks like just a whole bunch of random letters put in a whole bunch of order, but you really got to take a close look and break it down. So for any one of these directories, whether it's desktop or folders or pictures or any one of these, you notice they all start with a D, which means that this is a directory. You notice there is one in there, examples.desktop, that's actually a file, and that one starts with a dash. So that's what the very first letter indicates. Is this a directory, or is this a file? So if I were to do my ls-l command for the contents of folder 1, remember this is where we have that test file. You notice here it says test, and that test file starts with a dash because that is not a directory, that's a file that contains information. So ls-l, that very first bit indicates, is this a directory or is this a file? Now the next few bits are listed in groups of 3. Okay, and the 3 that you'll see in order here will always be R, W, and X. And what these stand for are read, write, and execute permissions. And so what we're listing here 3 times, do we have read, write, and execute permissions? So the first 3, R, W, and X, indicate the owner of the file. Does the owner of the file have read permissions? Does the owner of the file have write permissions? Does the owner of the file have execute permissions? Okay, and you notice for all of these directories, all the ones that start with D, the user, NSA in this case, has read, write, and execute permissions to the directories in his home directory. You notice the file, the example.desktop, he's got read and write permission, but then there's a dash. The dash means he does not have this permission. He does not have the execute permission. Okay. The next will indicate the group that they're a part of. Users end up being part of a group, so you'll notice here that there is a read permission for any of the users in the group, but they do not have the W, which means they don't have the write permission. So R, W, and X, it ends up saying R-X, so they have read permission, they have execute permission, but they can't actually write to this location. Any users that share a group as NSA will not actually be able to write to these locations. And then finally there's an everyone else. So that's the last one here. Everyone else also has the read permission, they don't have the write permission, and many of them do have the execute. So they could execute things out of these locations, but they wouldn't actually be able to write information to this location. Okay? So that's understanding this, understanding the breakdown is important of what permissions, how to read that. Now let's take a look for our test file that we made. We ended up just touching a test file, and you notice there it's got the dash, which means it's not a directory, it's a file. The owner of the file, us, NSA, have read permissions and write permissions, but currently we don't have execute permissions to the file we created. Anyone in our group also has read permissions and write permissions. Someone who is part of the same group as us would also be able to write to this test file. And you notice everyone else, the blanket to everyone else just says, well, everyone else can read the file, but they would not be able to write the file, they would not be able to execute the file either. Okay, and that's how these permissions work. Now let's start to see, that's just listing existing permissions. What if I wanted to modify this? How do I change this? I'm going to make a tiny little reference down here because understanding how to change this gets a little tricky. Okay, so the way that we understand how to change our permissions, you have to understand there's kind of 4 permissions you could have. I could have no permissions to a file, I could have read permissions to a file, I could have write permissions to a file, and then finally I could have execute permissions to a file. We said that R, W, and X. All dashes would mean you have no permissions at all. And the way that Linux keeps track of this is it does this through a numbering system. Okay? So here's where we'll have I'll make just a quick little reference in a little document down here so we can reference this as we're going through. 4 means you have read permissions. 2 means you have write permissions, 1 means you have execute permissions, and 0 would mean you have no permission at all. Okay, so let's see how this is built into the command that we use to actually change permissions. So we'll keep that in mind. 4 means you can read, 2 means you can write, 1 means you can execute, 0 would mean no permissions at all. Okay, now the command that we can use to actually change permissions of a file, and let's do it through that folder 1, the test file there in folder 1, that'll be the one we'll be going for, is the chmod command, or the chmod command, however you want to say it. And the way you do this is you would type out chmod, and then you end up typing 3 numbers. Okay, and each one of those numbers in order represents, as we saw here above, the permissions I want to give to the owner of the file, the permissions I want to give to the group of the file, and then finally the permissions I want to give to everyone else. So that first number represents the owner of the file, the second number represents the group that the owner is part of, and then the third represents everyone else. And then you list the file that you want to be a part of. Now the numbers that you're going to be listing are going to be somewhere between 0 and 7, and that is because each number indicates the sum of the read, write, execute, or no permissions. So for example, if I wanted to give myself full permissions to the file, that would be read, write, and execute. The very first number I would type would be a 7. And where does a 7 come from? It comes from the fact that 4 represents read, 2 represents write, and 1 represents execute. So you add them all together, and I would say you get a 7. Okay, so chmod 7, okay, this would give me the owner of the file to have full read, write, and execute. The next number would indicate, well, what do I give to the people in the same group? Let's say I also want to give them read, write, and execute permissions. I could type another 7. And then finally I might say, you know, this file here, it's not all that important. It's a general file, it's a public file. I want everyone else to also have read, write, and execute permissions to the file. I could list a third 7. So I'll say chmod 777. This is giving full permissions to everyone on the computer who might want to interact with this file. And where is the file? The file is in folder 1/test. Okay, I go ahead and hit enter. Now I'm going to do an ls-l to list permissions of folder 1. Okay, folder 1, enter, and we see how now it still starts with a dash. Okay, our test file, because it's not a directory, it's a file, and my permissions have now changed to read, write, execute, rwx, rwx, rwx. So I've given read, write, and execute permissions to everyone on the computer through this 777 command. Okay, so that's pretty powerful. I've taken this and said anyone can interact with this file. They could all change it, they could all delete it, etc. Now let's say I want to be, well, this file is actually something that is important to me from a security point of view, and I don't want anyone else to be able to interact with this file but me. So how would I actually do that? Let's change the permissions again, do a chmod. But this time I want to have it so I have permissions, but nobody else does. So how would I do that? I might go and say 7 to give me full read, write, and execute permissions. But everyone in my group, they get no permission, so I would say 0. Everyone else on the computer, I could also say 0. And then I'll add in my folder 1/test and hit an enter. So now when I do my ls-l again on folder 1, I'll just hit an up arrow twice. And you'll see now I've got read, write, and execute permissions for me. Everyone else gets a whole bunch of dashes. So maybe this is my personal file. I want to be able to modify things, but I don't want anyone else to be able to see what's going on in here. They can't read it, they can't look at it, they can't touch this particular location. Okay, so that's all done through a 700, kind of a common thing if I've got a file that I want to lock down just for myself. Let's take it a step further and say, well, what if I want something maybe a little bit in between? Maybe I want me to be able to have full permissions to the file, so I'll start out with my chmod 7, okay? But I want other people, they can see the file, and that's it. I only want them to be able to see the file. They can't write to the file, they can't execute the file, they can't do anything else. So how could I give them just write permission, or excuse me, just read permissions? You see, you could do that through a 4, okay? So chmod 7 4, and then another 4 to say everyone else, again through this folder 1/test. And now when I take a look at my ls-l of what's in folder 1, you see I gave myself read, write, and execute. However, they only have the r dash dash, r dash dash. So now they can read the file, but they can't actually execute the file. So that was accomplished through a 4. Take it a step further and say, maybe I want, maybe I don't want to give myself write permissions to the file. Maybe I just want to be able to read it. Maybe it's something that I really have no purpose of ever really changing this, and I kind of want to protect myself even from myself by taking away my own write permissions. However, I might have to execute this at some point. So I could do a chmod, and now I'm going to get rid of my own write permissions. So I want to keep read and I want to keep execute. So remember, you got to kind of add these up. So I'll take my 4 plus 1 and I'll give myself a 5 for permissions. And then I'll keep everyone else at only a read permission. So everyone else has a 4. I end up doing 5, 4, 4 of folder1/test. Okay, now when I take a look at my ls-l again, what's going to happen? You see I've given myself read permissions, I've taken away write permissions, I still have execute, everyone else only has the R and the R. So this little reference here of what number is associated with read, what number is associated with write, what number is associated with execute is very important to kind of see. You'll have something either 1, you'll have a 3, you'll have a 4, maybe you'll have a 5, a 6, a 7, and understanding what that actually corresponds to is really important. And also understanding the order. The user comes first, then the users group, then everyone else. When in doubt, if you want to give yourself full permissions, a common thing is doing 7 and then 0, 0. You give everyone else no permissions. If I want to kind of take this file and say, no, it's mine, no one else should be able to touch this. In future videos, we'll kind of see how this starts to relating to other files on the system, as well as kind of what users sort of get added to which groups, and how can I continue to operate across the computer in a secure fashion, or what do I need to do when I want to share a file or a directory to another user.